In 2017, I published this book, Champion of the Quarterdeck. It was a work of some 25 to 30 years, and it all began with a shipwreck that my son and I endured up in Papua New Guinea. I was working as an assistant district officer, and I was sent out to an island called the Quarterdeck Atoll. We left about an hour too early on instructions from a senior officer, and we arrived at the reef just before dawn. The captain had used dead reckoning, just a compass, nothing else, and he missed the opening to the reef by about 200 metres. So we ran up onto the reef just before dawn on a king tide, and the ship went up high and rolled on its side. So we were successfully rescued from there, and I didn't worry too much about it afterwards. But when I left New Guinea in 72, end of 72, I started to wonder why that atoll was called the Quarterdeck Atoll. And I started reading up about Carteret. Found he was a British officer, a naval officer, and he had been credited with discovering the Quarterdeck Atoll on a voyage around the world. But while I was researching Carteret, I kept seeing references to his lieutenant on the Swallow, which was the vessel that they discovered the Carterets in. The more I read about Gower, the more intrigued I became. He'd obviously had a very extensive career, much more so than Carteret had had, and he was pretty much unsung. I found it very difficult to find primary sources in his own handwriting or reports that he'd done. He was very sparing with his words about himself, but by researching other captains, other ships, other logbooks, and reports to and from the Admiralty, I was able to build up a picture of him, and I decided to launch into doing a biography of him. So I decided that probably seriously around about 95, around about 2010, I had a manuscript of 480,000 words. I had 12 gigabytes of data, 46,000 files on my computer that related to that particular book draft. It was only when I estimated or counted up the words in a standard book that I realised that I now had enough material for 6 volumes. So it became obvious fairly soon that I had to do something serious about that. So the editing started. What's really captured my imagination about Gower was his modesty. The more I looked into his career, the more I realised how much he had done, how much influence he'd had, how much he'd influenced other people who'd come under his command, particularly how strong he was in the face of adversity, and yet he very rarely wrote anything about it. He went through all sorts. He was shot in the mouth once and hardly even mentioned it. He was deprived of food, he was starved, he was shipwrecked. He very rarely mentioned himself in any of these reports. Gower probably had a more diverse career than any other officer in the Royal Navy in that period, and yet hardly anybody had heard of him, and I thought that was unjust. He started off his career with his uncle and went to war in 1755. His uncle John Dogley took him to America. Gower experienced war over there as a young man of 15. He was chosen by Captain John Byron to accompany him around the world on a circumnavigation that was top secret. Gower had only been back in England a month or two, and he was chosen to then go on a second expedition under the command of Captain Wallace in the Dolphin with a support ship, the Swallow, under Captain Carteret. Had only been home a short while and was then sent to Patagonia, or to the Falklands, where he was then shipwrecked in Patagonia. He spent 3-4 years in the West Indies. He then joined a ship in the Mediterranean under Captain Murray. He had an extreme amount of success. Captain Murray and Gower captured a huge number of American, French and Spanish ships during that 3 or 4 years. Most of his career was during wartime. It was a period of constant wars. There was the French wars in the 1750s onwards, and that was an undeclared war for a lot of the time that he was involved. Then he was involved in the Revolutionary War. In the Mediterranean, his job with Captain Murray was to apprehend ships that may be carrying contraband from France to help the American cause. And there were a lot of instances where they captured ships and documents that proved that France was actively supporting the Americans long before the French declared war. At the end of that period, he was then taken on as first lieutenant in Admiral Rodney's flagship, the Sandwich, and on the way to Gibraltar, the Sandwich captured a merchant fleet, and Gower was then given the warship that was leading that merchant ship. He was given that as a post captain, so that was when he got his promotion to post captain. The war was progressing. He was then given a frigate, a 28-gun frigate, the Medea, and went to India, where he had much more success. He captured a ship on the way over there. He recaptured a British sloop that had been captured by the French, and it had dispatches, so they were able to get an insight into what the French fleet were doing from those dispatches. And he also captured a huge Dutch ship which had just been sold to the French to be converted to a warship. And that was a valuable prize. He was offered £30,000 for the hull and cargo, which was several $1 million in today's money. He was called for what to many officers would have been the career of a lifetime, or the promotion of a lifetime. He was chosen by Lord Macartney to take his embassy to China. This was to be the first British embassy to China, and Gower led that in the warship Lion. Over a period of 2 years, they went all the way to China. Gower mapped for the first time by a European the whole of the Yellow Sea. On return from China, with Britain at war, he was immediately posted to the Triumph. Gower was one of the officers who was very keen on fleets sharing captures. When they were a part of a squadron of, say, 6 or 8 ships, he believed that they would have more success if they could allow 1 or 2 ships to chase and share the proceeds of the prize if those ships captured a ship, because under the system that had been operating, everybody would chase, trying to be the first one there to get the prize. So therefore he and his crew shared in a lot of prizes. He captured some ships. Other ships were able to go off and capture ships without worrying about what the fleet was doing. He was at sea when a huge mutiny happened at Spithead. The whole fleet mutinied, refused to take the sea under Lord Bridport. However, the discontent had then travelled to the Nore at the mouth of the Thames, and it was a much different mutiny. There was a lot of violence. There were floggings in the fleet. captains and lieutenants and masters were knocked about, and there were deaths. The mutiny was over pay and conditions. People were still getting paid what they'd been getting paid 100 years earlier. They saw that the army personnel were getting pay rises, and they could not see why they weren't. The other thing was that they were lacking leave because the British fleet had started using copper bottoms. They were putting copper sheet on the sheathing on the bottoms of the ships to keep the worm out, stop the erosion of the hulls. The ships could then come into harbour, refresh with food and any sails, anything that needed fixing up, and then back out again. And quite often the crews weren't given shore leave because the ships were only in harbour as long as it took to load the provisions. Gower had faced a minor mutiny on his own ship, the Triumph, and he then walked off the ship. His crew then petitioned him to come back because they said he wasn't the problem, but he said, if you don't accept all my officers, you don't accept me. And this could have cost him his career, but in actual fact the Admiralty were looking for a capable officer that they could trust, and they then appointed him to the Neptune, which was a very large brand new ship that hadn't sailed yet. It was in the head of up at the head of the Thames. He took command of that and put together a fleet of volunteers in volunteer ships and blockaded the mutineers from travelling up to London. It was largely when he moved down to Longreach to get his guns on board. This ship could carry 100 guns. The mutiny started to break up, and Gower was then one of the members of the court-martials, which court-martialed a huge number of men. Many of them were hung, many of them were transported to Australia, and he didn't enjoy that task at all. He always struggled with courts martial. After his last command in the Channel Fleet, he went into semi-retirement. He was quite ill. He had gout and had quite a lot of illness, and he was getting old. He decided to go into retirement. He was a Rear Admiral by this stage, but the government decided that he would be a suitable candidate to become Governor of Newfoundland, and so he was appointed. And the main reason for having a governor in St John's, Newfoundland, was because of the huge fishing fleet that visited during the summer and fished there. He found that there were a lot of permanent fishermen there who stayed on during the winter, and the whole place had changed. It had then become quite a difficult place to maintain without being able to get supplies from America, which was a banned area for British supplies. And so Gower spent a lot of his time there negotiating to be able to get legal access to American produce to feed the population. He had great concerns about the near extinction of the Biotic, the native people there, and that was something that he couldn't really do much about. He tried, but those Aboriginal people became extinct within 20 years of his departure. His main lasting change that he brought in was to revise the way the magistrates were paid. They had been paid out of the proceeds of fines, and so it was very easy for a magistrate to slap a fine on somebody and know that he was getting a cut. Gower changed that and put them onto a stipend so that they got paid whether they convicted or not. He was regarded as a very good administrator and a very thorough administrator. He led from the front. He wasn't afraid to stand on the deck while the cannonballs were flying about. He He had a lot of proteges who became very, very famous people serving under Nelson, and I could see his influence on a lot of those people. They served under him, sometimes only for a short period, but you can see the Gower stamp. I want him to become better known. I received a really good review from a very eminent historian called John Hattendorf in America, and he gave me a really good review, and he suggested that all the libraries should have this book. This is a reference book. He told me personally in an email, which I don't mind divulging, that a lot of us who call ourselves naval historians don't expect to be acknowledged while we're still alive, but our books will be read when we're gone. I'm writing this book 250 years after Gower was shipwrecked in Patagonia. I'm hoping that my book will still be around in 200 years' time, and someone will pick it up and say, now this is an interesting man.
So after 15, 20 years of living with this guy, what do you feel about him?
I love him. He wouldn't, well, yes, he probably would appreciate that, because one of his favourite young men died on the trip to China, and he wrote to his sister saying, dearest Samuel has died. Now, we don't suspect there was anything going on between Gower and Samuel. It's just that he was training him to become an officer. He could see his potential, and the man died. The young man died. He was only 16 or 17, and Gower was gutted by that. And I think if I said I loved him, he'd probably say fair enough.